Note A of Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Note A. Liberalism. I have been asked to explain more fully what it is I mean by Liberalism, because merely to call it the anti-dogmatic principle is to tell very little about it. An explanation is the more necessary, because such good Catholics and distinguished writers as Count Montalembert and Father Lacordaire use the word in a favourable sense, and claim to be liberals themselves. The only singularity, says the former of the two in describing his friend, was his liberalism. By a phenomenon at that time unheard of, this convert, this seminarist, this confessor of nuns, was just as stubborn a liberal, as in the days when he was a student and a barrister. I do not believe that it is possible for me to differ in my important matters from two men whom I so highly admire. In their general line of thought and conduct I enthusiastically concur, and consider them to be before their age. And it would be strange indeed if it did not read with a special interest in M. de Montalembert's beautiful volume of the unselfish aims, the thwarted projects, the unrequited toils, the grand and tender resignation of Lacordaire. If I hesitate to adopt their language about Liberalism, I impute the necessity of such hesitation to some differences between us in the use of words or in the circumstances of country, and thus I reconcile myself to remaining faithful to my own conception of it, though I cannot have their voices to give force to mine. Speaking then in my own way, I proceed to explain what I meant as a Protestant by Liberalism, and to do so in connection with the circumstances under which that system of opinion came before me at Oxford. If I might presume to contrast Lacordaire and myself, I should say that we had been both of us inconsistent; he a Catholic in calling himself a Liberal, I a Protestant in being an anti-Liberal, and moreover, that the cause of this inconsistency had been in both cases one and the same, that is, we were both of us such good conservatives as to take up with what we happened to find established in our respective countries, at the time when we came into active life. Toryism was the creed of Oxford; he inherited and made the best of the French Revolution. When in the beginning of the present century, not very long before my own time, after many years of moral and intellectual declension, the University of Oxford woke up to a sense of its duties and began to reform itself, the first instruments of this change, to whose zeal and courage we all owe so much, were naturally thrown together for mutual support, against the numerous obstacles which lay in their path, and soon stood out in relief from the body of residents who, though many of them men of talent themselves, cared little for the object which the other had at heart. These Reformers, as they may be called, were for some years members of scarcely more than 3 or 4 colleges, and their own college, as being under their direct influence, of course had the benefit of those stricter views of discipline and teaching which they themselves were urging on the University. They had, in no long time, enough of real progress in the several spheres of exertion, and enough of reputation out of doors, to warrant them in considering themselves the élite of the place; and it is not wonderful if they were in consequence led to look down upon the majority of colleges, which had not kept pace with the reform, or which had been hostile to it. And when those rivalries of one man with another arose, whether personal or collegiate, which befall literary and scientific societies, such disturbances did but tend to raise in their eyes the value which they had already set upon academical distinction, and increase their zeal in pursuing it. Thus was formed an intellectual circle or class in the University, men who felt they had a career before them as soon as the pupils whom they were forming came into public life, men whom non-residents, whether country parsons or preachers of the Low Church, or coming up from time to time to the old place, would look at, partly with admiration, partly with suspicion, as being an honour indeed to Oxford, but withal exposed to the temptation of ambitious views and to the spiritual evils signified in what is called the pride of reason. Nor was this imputation altogether unjust, for, as they were following out the proper idea of a University, of course they suffered more or less from the moral malady incident to such a pursuit. The very object of such great institutions lies in the cultivation of the mind and the spread of knowledge. If this object, as all human objects, has its dangers at all times, much more would these exist in the case of men who were engaged in a work of reformation, and had the opportunity of measuring themselves, not only with those who were their equals in intellect, but with the many who were below them. In this select circle or class of men, in various colleges, the direct instruments and the choice fruit of real University reform, we see the rudiments of the Liberal party. Whenever men are able to act at all, there is the chance of extreme and intemperate action, and therefore, when there is exercise of mind, there is the chance of wayward or mistaken exercise. Liberty of thought is in itself a good, but it gives an opening to false liberty. Now by Liberalism I mean false liberty of thought, or the exercise of thought upon matters, in which, from the constitution of the human mind, thought cannot be brought to any successful issue, and therefore is out of place. Among such matters are first principles of whatever kind, and of these the most sacred and momentous are especially to be reckoned the truth of revelation. Liberalism then is the mistake of subjecting to human judgment those revealed doctrines which are in their nature beyond and independent of it, and of claiming to determine on extrinsic grounds the truth and value of propositions which rest for their reception simply on the external authority of the Divine Word. Now certainly the party of whom I have been speaking, taken as a whole, were of a character of mind out of which Liberalism might easily grow up, as in fact it did. Certainly they breathed around an influence which made men of religious seriousness shrink into themselves. But, while I say as much as this, I have no intention whatever of implying that the talent of the University, in the years before and after 1820, was liberal in its theology, in the sense in which the bulk of the educated class through the country are liberal now. I would not for the world be supposed to detract from the Christian earnestness and the activity in religious works above the average of men of many of the persons in question. They would have protested against their being supposed to place reason before faith, or knowledge before devotion. Yet I do consider that they unconsciously encouraged and successfully introduced into Oxford a license of opinion which went far beyond them. In their day they did little more than take credit to themselves for enlightened views, largeness of mind, liberality of sentiment, without drawing the line between what was just and what was inadmissible in speculation, and without seeing the tendency of their own principle, and engrossing, as they did, the mental energy of the University, they met for a time with no effectual hindrance to the spread of their influence, except, what indeed at the moment was most effectual, but not of an intellectual character, the thoroughgoing Toryism and traditionary Church of Englandism of the great body of the colleges and Convocation. Now and then a man of note appeared in the pulpit or lecture rooms of the University, who was a worthy representative of the more religious and devout Anglicans. These belonged chiefly to the High Church party, for the party called Evangelical never has been able to breathe freely an atmosphere at Oxford, and at no time has been conspicuous as a party for talent or learning. But of the old High Churchmen, several exerted some sort of anti-liberal influence in the place, at least from time to time, and that influence of an intellectual nature. Among these especially may be mentioned Mr. John Miller of Worcester College, who preached the Bampton Lecture in the year 1817. But as far as I know, he who turned the tide and brought the talent of the University round to the side of the old theology, and against what was familiarly called march of mind, was Mr. Keble. In and from Mr. Keble the mental activity of Oxford took that contrary direction which issued in what was called Tractarianism. Keble was young in years when he became a University celebrity, and younger in mind. He had a purity and simplicity of a child. He had few sympathies with the intellectual party, who sincerely welcomed him as a brilliant specimen of young Oxford. He instinctively shut up before literary display, and pomp and donnishness of manner, faults which always will beset academical notability. He did not respond to their advances. His collision with them, if it may be so called, was thus described by Hurrell Froude in his own way. "Poor Keble," he used gravely to say, "he was asked to join the aristocracy of talent, but he soon found his level. He went into the country; but his instance serves to prove that men need not, in the event, lose that influence which is rightly theirs, because they happen to be thwarted in the use of the channels natural and proper to its exercise. He did not lose his place in the minds of men because he was out of their sight." Keble was a man who guided himself and formed his judgments, not by process of reason, by inquiry, or by argument, but, to use the word in a broad sense, by authority. Conscience is an authority, the Bible is an authority, such is the Church, such is antiquity, such are the words of the wise, such are hereditary lessons, such are ethical truths, such are historical memories, such are legal saws and state maxims, such are proverbs, such are sentiments, presages, and prepossessions. It seemed to me as if he ever felt happier when he could speak or act under some such primary or external sanction, and could use argument mainly as a means of recommending or explaining what had claims on his reception prior to proof. He even felt a tenderness, I think, in spite of Bacon, for the idols of the tribe and the den, of the market and the theatre. What he hated instinctively was heresy, insubordination, resistance to things established, claims of independence, disloyalty, innovation, a critical censorious spirit. And such was the main principle of the school which in the course of years was formed around him. Nor is it easy to set limits to its influence in its day, for a multitude of men, who did not profess its teaching, or accept its peculiar doctrines, were willing nevertheless, or found it to their purpose, to act in company with it. Indeed, for a time it was practically the champion and advocate of the political doctrines of the great clerical interests through the country, who found in Mr. Keble and his friends an intellectual as well as moral support to their cause, which they looked for in vain elsewhere. His weak point in their eyes was his consistency, for he carried his love of authority and old times so far as to be more than gentle towards the Catholic religion, with which the Toryism of Oxford and of the Church of England had no sympathy. Accordingly, if my memory be correct, he never could get himself to throw his heart into the opposition made to Catholic emancipation, strongly as he revolted from the politics and the instruments by means of which that emancipation was won. I fancy he would have had no difficulty in accepting Dr. Johnson's saying about the first Whig, and it grieved and offended him that the Via Prima Salutis should be open to the Catholic body from the Whig quarter. In spite of his reverence for the old religion, I conceive that, on the whole, he would rather have kept its professors beyond the pale of the Constitution with the Tories, than admit them on the principle of the Whigs. Moreover, if the Revolution of 1688 was too lax in principle for him and his friends, much less, as is very plain, could they endure to subscribe to the revolutionary doctrines of 1776 and 1789, which they felt to be absolutely and entirely out of keeping with theological truth. The old Tory or Conservative party in Oxford had in it no principle or power of development, and that from its very nature and constitution it was otherwise with the Liberals. They represented a new idea, which was but gradually learning to recognize itself, to ascertain its characteristics and external relations, and to exert an influence upon the University. The party grew all the time that I was in Oxford, even in numbers, certainly in breadth and definiteness of doctrine and in power. And what was a far higher consideration, by the accession of Dr. Arnold's pupils, it was invested with an elevation of character which claimed the respect even of its opponents. On the other hand, in proportion as it became more earnest and less self-applauding, it became more free-spoken, and members of it might be found who, from the mere circumstances of remaining firm to their original professions, would, in the judgment of the world, as to their public acts, seem to have left it for the conservative camp. Thus, neither in its component parts nor in its policy was it the same in 1832, 1836, and 1841 as it was in 1845. These last remarks will serve to throw light upon a matter personal to myself, which I have introduced into my narrative, and to which attention has been pointedly called, now that my volume is coming to a second edition. It has been strongly urged upon me to reconsider the following passages which occur in it. The men who had driven me from Oxford were distinctly the Liberals. It was they who had opened the attack upon Tract 90, p. 203, and I found no fault with the Liberals. They had beaten me in a fair field, p. 214. I am very unwilling to seem ungracious, or to cause pain in any quarter, still I am sorry to say I cannot modify these statements. It is surely a matter of historical fact that I left Oxford upon the University proceeding in 1841, and in those proceedings, whether we look to the heads of house or the resident masters, the leaders, if intellect and influence make men such, were members of the Liberal party. Those who did not lead, concurred, or acquiesced in them, I may say, felt a satisfaction. I do not recollect any Liberal who was on my side on that occasion. Excepting the Liberal, no other party as a party acted against me. I am not complaining of them. I deserved nothing else at their hands. They could not undo in 1845, even had they wished it, and there is no proof they did, what they had done in 1841. In 1845, when I had already given up the contest for 4 years, and my part of it had passed into the hands of others, then some of those who were prominent against me in 1841, feeling, what they had not felt in 1841, the danger of driving a number of my followers to Rome, and joined by younger friends who had come into University importance since 1841, and felt kindly towards me, adopted a course more consistent with their principles, and proceeded to shield from the zeal of the Hebdomadal Board, not me, but, professedly, all parties through the country, Tractarians, Evangelicals, Liberals in general, who had to subscribe to the Anglican formularies, on the ground that those formularies, rigidly taken, were on some point or other a difficulty to all parties alike. However, besides the historical fact, I can bear witness to my own feelings at the time, and my feeling was this, that those who in 1841 had considered it to be a duty to act against me, had then done their worst. What was it to me what they were doing in opposition to the new test proposed by the Hebdomadal Board? I owed them no work for their trouble. I took no interest at all. In February 1845, in the proceedings of the heads of the houses and of the Convocation, I felt myself dead as regarded my relations to the Anglican Church. My leaving it was all but a matter of time. I believe I did not even thank my real friends, the two proctors, who in Convocation stopped by their veto the condemnation of Tract 90, nor did I make any acknowledgment to Mr. Rogers, nor to Mr. James Moseley, nor, as I think, to Mr. Hussey, for their pamphlets in my behalf. My frame of mind is best described by the sentiment of the passage in Horace, which at the time I was fond of quoting, as expressing my view of the relations that existed between the Vice-Chancellor and myself. Pentu rector Thebarum, quid me perferre patique, indignum cogas, adimam bona, nepe pecus rem, lectos argentum tollis licet, in manisis et compedibus sevo te sub custode tenebo, namely the 39 Articles. Ipse Deus simo atque volam me solvet, opinor ac sentit moria mors ultima linea rerum est. I conclude this notice of Liberalism in Oxford, and the party which was antagonistic to it, with some propositions in detail, which, as a member of the latter, and together with the High Church, I earnestly denounced and abjured. 1. No religious tenet is important unless reason shows it to be so. Therefore, for example, the doctrine of the Athanasian Creed is not to be insisted on, unless it tends to convert the soul, and the doctrine of the Atonement is to be insisted on, if it does convert the soul. 2. No one can believe what he does not understand. Therefore, for example, there are no mysteries in true religion. 3. No theological doctrine is anything more than an opinion which happens to be held by bodies of men. Therefore, for example, no creed as such is necessary for salvation. 4. It is dishonest in a man to make an act of faith in what he has not had brought home to him by actual proof. Therefore, for example, the mass of men ought not absolutely to believe in the divine authority of the Bible. 5. It is immoral in a man to believe more than he can spontaneously receive as being congenial to his moral and mental nature. Therefore, for example, a given individual is not bound to believe in eternal punishment. 6. No revealed doctrines or precepts may reasonably stand in the way of scientific conclusions. Therefore, for example, political economy may reverse our Lord's declarations about poverty and riches, or a system of ethics may teach that the highest condition of body is ordinarily essential to the highest state of mind. 7. Christianity is necessarily modified by the growth of civilization and the exigencies of times. Therefore, for example, the Catholic priesthood, though necessary in the Middle Ages, may be superseded now. 8. There is a system of religion more simply true than Christianity as it has ever been received. Therefore, for example, we may advance that Christianity is the corn of wheat which has been dead for 1800 years, but at length will bear fruit, and that Mahometanism is the manly religion, and existing Christianity the womanish. 9. There is a right of private judgment, that is, there is no existing authority on earth competent to interfere with the liberty of individuals in reasoning and judging for themselves about the Bible and its contents, as they severally please. Therefore, for example, religious establishments requiring subscriptions are anti-Christian. 10. There are rights of conscience such that every one may lawfully advance a claim to profess and teach what is false and wrong in matters religious, social, and moral, provided that to his private conscience it seems absolutely true and right. Therefore, for example, individuals have a right to preach and practice fornication and polygamy. 11. There is no such thing as national estate conscience. Therefore, for example, no judgments can fall upon a sinful or infidel nation. 12. The civil power has no positive duty, in a normal state of things, to maintain religious truth. Therefore, for example, blasphemy and Sabbath breaking are not rightly punishable by law. 13. Utility and expedience are the measure of political duty. Therefore, for example, no punishment may be enacted on the ground that God commands it. For example, on the text, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." 14. The civil power may dispose of church property without sacrilege. Therefore, for example, Henry VIII committed no sin in his spoliations. 15. The civil power has the right of ecclesiastical jurisdiction and administration. Therefore, for example, Parliament may impose articles of faith on the Church or suppress dioceses. 16. It is lawful to rise in arms against legitimate princes. Therefore, for example, the Puritans of the 17th century and the French in the 18th were justifiable in their rebellion and revolution respectively. 17. The people are the legitimate source of power. Therefore, for example, universal suffrage is among the natural rights of man. 18. Virtue is the child of knowledge, and vice of ignorance. Therefore, for example, education, periodical literature, railroad travelling, ventilation, drainage, and the arts of life, when fully carried out, serve to make a population moral and happy. All of these propositions, and many others too, were familiar to me 30 years ago as in the number of the tenets of Liberalism; and while I gave in to none of them except No. 12 and perhaps No. 11, and partly No. 1, before I began to publish, so afterwards I wrote against most of them in some part or other of my Anglican works. If it is necessary to refer to a work, not simply my own, but of the Tractarian school, which contains a similar protest, I should name the Lyra Apostolica. This volume, which by accident has been left unnoticed, except incidentally in my narrative, was collected together from the pages of the British Magazine, in which its contents originally appeared, and published in a separate form immediately after Hurrell Froude's death in 1836. Its signatures. Readers note: the following are Greek letters: A, Ba, Ga, Da, E, Kas, denotes respectively as authors Mr. Bowden, Mr. Hurrell Froude, Mr. Keble, Mr. Newman, Mr. Robert Wilberforce, and Mr. Isaac Williams. There is one poem on Liberalism beginning, "Ye cannot halve the gospel of God's grace," which bears out the account of Liberalism as above given, and another upon "the age to come," defining from its own point of view the position and prospects of Liberalism. I need hardly say that the above note is mainly historical. How far the Liberal party of 1830 1840 really held the above 18 theses which I attribute to them, and how far and in what sense I should oppose those theses now, could scarcely be explained without a separate dissertation.